Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome back to The Explainer, where we take complex, heavy research and break it down into actual, clear takeaways. Today we're looking at a highly debated, obviously very timely topic: how mass deportation policies actually impact the housing market and construction costs. Now, I know this is an issue that absolutely dominates political headlines, but we are going to strip away the politics entirely today. Instead, we're strictly looking at the data, the economics, and honestly, the incredibly unexpected realities of what happens when massive population shifts collide with our housing supply.
Let me start off by asking you something that, on the surface, sounds totally counterintuitive. If mass deportation removes people who are actively consuming housing, people who rent apartments and buy homes, why in the world would home prices actually go up? The math seems so simple, right? Fewer people should mean less demand, which should literally mean cheaper housing. But as we're about to see through some really rigorous economic data, the reality of housing markets is way, way more complex than just simple subtraction.
To understand this whole paradox, you got to think of the housing market like a giant economic seesaw, with two main forces constantly pushing against each other. On the left side, we've got the demand effect. A growing population, which includes immigrants, adds consumers to the market, and that inherently puts upward pressure on rents and home prices. But then on the right side, we have the supply effect. Immigrants historically make up a massive, massive portion of our construction workforce. When you have more builders, costs go down, and the actual supply of housing expands. And recent research from the Dallas Fed, plus some really fascinating studies on Afghan refugees in Iran, confirm that both of these pressures are literally always at play. The ultimate price of a home? Well, that just depends on which side of this seesaw happens to be heavier.
All right, part one, the demand side effect.
Let's isolate that first force. There is a very real, very documented demand effect, and this number really just sums it up perfectly: 40%. According to research from the Bipartisan Policy Center and Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies, immigrants have made up about 40% of all housing demand since 2010. And this demand overwhelmingly impacts the rental segment. In fact, recent immigrants accounted for roughly 2/3 of the overall renter household growth in recent years. So it is just an undeniable economic fact that a steady inflow of people increases the base demand for a place to live.
And naturally, you'd think that demand immediately translates to higher prices. Well, there's an incredibly comprehensive meta-analysis from the ISA Institute of Labor Economics that looked at this. They analyzed 474 different estimates across 14 destination countries. Their conclusion? On average, yes, immigration does increase house prices. But, and this is a fascinating caveat, they found that in areas where local attitudes toward immigrants are negative, house price increases are surprisingly moderated. Why? Because those negative attitudes essentially make the neighborhood less appealing to the local native population. It lowers what economists call its amenity value, making locals less willing to pay premium prices to live there. It's just a crazy interesting look at how human psychology directly messes with real estate data.
Let's move to and see how this builds, literally. Section 2, the construction labor backboard.
So we've seen the demand side, but now we absolutely have to pivot to the flip side of the coin, supply. If you want to know why housing supply is so constrained in the United States right now, just listen to this staggering figure. According to a nationwide survey by the Associated General Contractors of America, a whopping 92% of construction firms report they are having a hard time finding qualified workers to hire. The industry is facing a severe, chronic labor shortage. There simply aren't enough builders to build the homes that the market demands.
And this labor shortage, it has massive ripple effects. Currently, 45% of construction firms are experiencing project delays specifically because they just can't find enough workers. And here is exactly where immigration policy intersects with your local housing market. 28% of these firms report being directly or indirectly impacted by immigration enforcement activities. Now you might be wondering, why don't they just use legal work visas? Well, only about 10% of firms use programs like H-2B visas because the system is notoriously complex and difficult to navigate for this specific type of work. The reality on the ground is that unauthorized labor forms the structural backbone of the U.S. construction sector. When enforcement actions throttle this super fragile labor supply chain, housing projects stall and prices inevitably go up.
Which brings us to the big collision, Section 3, when the workforce disappears.
So, we have rising demand on one hand and a fragile, heavily immigrant-reliant labor supply on the other. What exactly happens when these two economic forces violently collide because of a federal policy? To answer that, economists from NBR and UC Berkeley Haas looked at a federal initiative called the Secure Communities Program. It rolled out between 2008 and 2013, and it led to the deportation of over 300,000 undocumented immigrants. For economists, this staggered rollout across different counties basically created a real-time clinical laboratory to study exactly how local housing markets react to a sudden, massive disruption in the labor supply.
Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer scale of the disruption. When undocumented workers were removed from these counties, home building completely stalled out. The researchers found that treated counties saw an annual reduction of 633 building permits. And even worse, realized construction, meaning actual physical homes entering the market, dropped by 1,178 homes per county per year. That is an entire year's worth of residential construction completely wiped out simply because the workforce vanished.
Which brings us to the ultimate economic twist of this whole explainer. When mass deportations happen, there is, in fact, a temporary drop in housing demand, and that can lead to a small, transient dip in home prices, usually concentrated in lower-income areas. But that effect is incredibly short-lived. The massive, devastating hit to the housing supply quickly overtakes it. Within 2 years, the sheer lack of new homes creates an intense upward pressure on prices. So the long-term supply shock entirely dominates that short-term demand drop, ultimately driving housing costs up for everyone.
But wait, it goes deeper than just home prices. Let's look at the surprising domino effect.
Because the impact doesn't stop at the price of your home. We need to zoom in from the macro national data down to the micro level of just a single construction site. Let's look at how this impacts American-born workers. Economists call this concept labor complementarity. But basically, it means construction crews aren't just a bunch of solo operators. They're highly interdependent teams. Step 1, an undocumented laborer is removed from a site. Step 2, because the foundational labor is missing, the entire project pipeline slows down. Step 3, with projects delayed, subcontractors have to suddenly cancel or scale back their operations. And Step 4, higher-skilled, U.S.-born tradesmen, we're talking electricians, plumbers, supervisors, suddenly find themselves out of work because the project they were scheduled for has just ground to a total halt.
The collateral damage of this domino effect is actually wild. Recent research shows that for every single undocumented worker arrested and removed from the construction sector, roughly 6 American-born workers also lose their jobs. Let that sink in. One missing link in the chain literally breaks the entire workflow.
So let's tally it all up, the ultimate price tag.
As we wrap up, we have to look at the real cost of these workforce shocks. Who actually wins and who loses when these policies are enacted? Now, a really common assumption is that if undocumented workers leave, domestic workers are just going to step in, fill the gap, and claim higher wages. But when you look at the data, that is entirely false. Following the Secure Communities enforcement, employment fell by 7.5% for undocumented construction workers, but it also fell by 3.0% for U.S.-born men without college degrees in that exact same sector. Domestic labor did not fill the gap. Instead, overall economic activity just shrank, and both groups suffered net job losses.
So the crucial point is exactly what these researchers from Berkeley and NBR concluded. Domestic labor flowing into the construction industry fails to fully offset employment losses. Immigration enforcement leads to reductions in total construction employment for U.S.-born workers, too. By shrinking the labor pool, we are actually harming the very domestic workers these policies often claim to protect, all while making it way harder and way more expensive to build the homes we desperately need.
Which leaves us with this final provocative thought. We've looked at the data impartially today. We've seen that removing immigrant labor crushes housing supply, drives up home prices, and triggers real job losses for American citizens in the construction sector. So if shrinking the workforce makes housing less affordable and actively costs domestic jobs, who is truly paying the price for mass deportation? It's a completely counterintuitive reality, but the numbers definitely speak for themselves. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the math behind the headlines.